Hi, my name is Simon Nicholson. I'm co-director of the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy at American University in Washington, D.C. And it's my pleasure to come speak with you about what's called direct air capture with carbon storage, or DACCS. I'm grateful to my friends at C2G for inviting me in to speak about some of the governance considerations related to DACCS. As a starting point, I'm going to say something that you've probably heard before if you've tracked what's going on with the carbon removal conversation. Carbon removal is now a necessary component of climate change response moving forward. Now, emissions abatement, that is keeping greenhouse gases from entering the atmosphere, remains the most important thing that collectively we need to do to tackle climate change. And adaptation, that is adapting to changes already baked into the system or that are bound to eventuate, is critical. But the science is now increasingly clear that removing large amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and putting that carbon dioxide into long-term storage is going to be important to prevent the worst possible outcomes when it comes to climate change. Okay, so governance in part is about making that happen. And at the same time, just saying carbon removal is essential shouldn't be seen as giving license for all forms of carbon removal to emerge and to imagine that they're all good, right? Number two here on my list, not all forms of carbon removal are created equal. The work of governance is to steer between good and bad outcomes, pushing towards the good and guarding against the bad. To govern is to steer. That's the largest understanding of what it means to govern. And in fact, that word to govern in English comes from a Greek word meaning to steer. And so when we're talking about the governance of something like direct air capture with carbon storage, we're talking about a range of different mechanisms that we have at our disposal to push towards good outcomes and guard against bad ones. And so the starting point for any conversation about the governance of something like direct air capture with carbon storage is to start to work out how to evaluate what good direct air capture looks like. Step one might be thinking about direct air capture in relation to all the other forms of carbon removal that we have at our disposal. And one of the great things that C2G is doing through this series of webinars and other talks is laying all of these options out for us. This particular chart, which you can see now, is from a paper by my American University colleague David Morrow and a bunch of colleagues. Just one representation of the options available to us. Direct air capture occupies a particular niche in relation to these range of options. It's an important niche because we're told that direct air capture has large potential capacity in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide that it could draw down. And if you add that carbon storage piece, the amount that could be put into long-term storage to draw down atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. But in certain places, with certain people in certain situations, maybe direct air capture is not the best option, right? And so thinking about that, direct air capture in relation to the other options available to us is important. Also, direct air capture is not one thing. There are lots of different potential ways that direct air capture could be put in place. And certain forms of direct air capture with carbon storage operating in particular locations, some could be good, some could be bad, depending on use. And so what we need to do is disaggregate what we mean by direct air capture with carbon storage. Think of the different steps here. Drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, separating that carbon dioxide from the air with some sort of chemical or mechanical membrane or other operation. The energy that goes into that, where does the energy come from? What is the use to which that carbon dioxide is going to be put? Is it a short-term or long-lived product, or is it going into long-term storage? Might there be pipelines involved in the moving of carbon dioxide around? There are lots of different components of a direct air capture with carbon storage operation. And each of those different components or facets is an area that requires understanding and governance or oversight. So just to make all of this as clear as I can, not all forms of carbon removal are created equal. Finding out what good carbon removal looks like requires us to pull apart what we mean by something like direct air capture with carbon storage to work out how to push in good directions and steer away from bad. A couple of other just high-level remarks, and then we'll move into a few more details. Often when people think about governance in relation to something like direct air capture with carbon storage, they think about the constraining aspects or elements that governance brings to bear. bad things could happen if direct air capture with carbon storage were done in a bad fashion. Or unanticipated or even anticipated bad things might emerge as things start to scale up. And so protecting against bad outcomes is the constraining role that governance needs to play. At the same time, though, an essential thing that needs to happen now is that governance produces, we use the mechanisms available to us to produce an enabling environment for investigation into what direct air capture with carbon storage might offer. These are the very earliest days of consideration of DACCS. And so getting the enabling environment right means money and other forms of resource to the scientific and potentially technological development communities to start doing the work of assessment and investigation and pilot projects and various other things that let us know what's actually possible with DACCS. That enabling environment needs to be put in place even as we start to think about the governance architecture that's required to constrain against bad outcomes emerging down the road. Two other quick things to say at the highest level. Governance is not just what governments do. So governance is not just the formal passing of laws and regulations. It's not just at the international level, the development of agreements and institutions. We also have informal forms of governance. So the ideas that we carry around in our heads collectively about what right forms of climate response look like constrain or open up opportunities for response. The way that people talk about carbon removal in relation to other forms of response is an important component of what it means to govern these options. And then scientific norms of right behavior and how we share information and so forth, all of these types of things, they shape outcomes, and so they should be thought of as carbon removal governance. And finally, here on this slide, we're talking about direct air capture, which operates in some sense at the global scale because it's helping us potentially to tackle this global problem of climate change. And so there's a need for international coordination around direct air capture. But most of the plants, if they were to be developed and operated at scale, direct air capture plants would operate inside particular jurisdictions. That is, they would sit in particular countries. And so that means much of the rulemaking and much of the oversight is going to be of a domestic nature. It's going to happen in a particular country. And I'll talk about those different elements of domestic oversight and international coordination as we move ahead here. So, what does it mean to set the right enabling environment? Well, there are a few things that we need to get right from the outset. One thing is transparency, establishing that there should be a certain amount of transparency around the development of the technologies that might aggregate to be direct air capture with carbon storage, which actually runs against the way corporations that might be involved in the development of these technologies, what they think of when it comes to technological development. The watchword for corporations typically when it comes to tech development is secrecy, not transparency, because corporations want to make money from their investment in technological development. Something like carbon removal, though, and something like direct air capture as a form of carbon removal, it's a response to a public threat. And so the response itself becomes something of a public good. Climate change is the threat, direct air capture is the good. We collectively need some understanding of what's being developed in response to this threat of climate change, and so transparency should be baked in as a consideration of governance. To get more granular, many people who are paying attention to pathways for development of something like direct air capture at scale are thinking about the forms of tax incentive or other direct payments that might be put in place. They're thinking about connections to emerging carbon markets and carbon price mechanisms or emissions targets. They're thinking about support for connections to niche markets. So for instance, if direct air capture were used to produce a liquid fuel, how do renewable fuel standards operate to shape what that market starts to look like and the connections between the development of direct air capture technologies and the uses to which the captured carbon dioxide might be put. The same could be said for taking carbon dioxide through direct air capture and putting it into building materials, long-lived cement. These are the sorts of niche markets that might be developed and connections that need to be made to generate capacity for direct air capture. And then direct support for research and development provided by government or collections of governments and tech transfer between different jurisdictions. These are some of the sorts of things that people are starting to work through. If you look down this list here, thinking about something like tax incentives or connections to carbon markets, we're talking about potentially large amounts of money. And when we're talking about large amounts of money, there's going to be politics at play. There's a concern in some quarters that direct air capture with carbon storage is something that could be captured by the fossil fuel industry, or could be something that is used politically to keep the fossil fuel industry just trucking along with business as usual, dangling the potential for direct air capture just over the horizon as a way to absolve us of all of our climate change sins. Now, if that were to happen, that's probably a bad outcome that we need to steer away from. So we need governance to make sure that tax incentives are applied in appropriate ways to development that is in the public interest. This is a conversation that's very lively at the moment in the United States around something called the 45Q tax credit, which provides money for corporations or other actors that can demonstrate that they're capturing significant amounts of carbon dioxide from the open air and putting it into storage. Most of the captured carbon at the moment that is being applied to, that tax credit is generating, is being used for what's called enhanced oil recovery. So oil companies are using captured carbon to push more oil out of the ground, which might not actually be a good thing in climate terms. And it also gives these corporations a fair amount of power in the way that direct air capture with carbon storage is starting to develop. And so as each of these mechanisms are put into place, we need to think about the implications of them for what direct air capture might ultimately be. A few additional things that need to be kept in mind. At the moment, I've been talking mainly about the carbon capture component of things. We also need to be paying attention to the carbon storage component of things. There are big regulatory questions and long-term monitoring questions when it comes to injection of carbon dioxide into the ground. As legal scholar Tracy Hester has noted a number of times, in most jurisdictions there are good laws in place that protect against bad outcomes from taking stuff out of the ground, setting it on fire, and creating pollution. If a factory does that, there are rules and regulations in place. But if you flip that around, imagine a factory that is drawing down pollution and sticking it back underground. We don't have good legal rules of the road in place to govern all of that. And so there's a good deal of work that needs to be done in terms of how to monitor, evaluate, understand, and coordinate across country lines on the storage of carbon dioxide for the long term. And back to that watchword of transparency, let's add to that the need for accountability. This is going to be something of a wild west, honestly, as we look forward into the carbon removal future. Lots of different people, corporations are going to come forward and say, hey, I've got this thing which could be really good. And we're going to need to be able to hold corporations and individuals to account if the promises that they make are just for the making of money and not for the benefit of the climate. Two more high-level needs, and then I'll end with a few principles that I want to bookmark for you and have you keep in mind. It's a well-known understanding inside climate circles that those who bear most of the costs of a changing climate have done least to contribute to the problem of climate change. We need to keep environmental justice considerations at the fore through this conversation about consideration of governance pathways and options for direct air capture. There's also an opportunity here in this COVID moment, thinking in terms of just transition, how we move away from the world that we have to the world as it might be. Direct air capture could be a component of that, but not if all of the benefits of direct air capture go to those who already have the most power, or if the control of direct air capture is given to those who already write the rules. There needs to be consideration of which voices need to be brought into this conversation, in what fashion to guard against bad, and in this case meaning unjust outcomes. And then I want to reinforce again that understanding that just because carbon removal is essential doesn't mean that all forms of carbon removal should be considered good. As we're evaluating what good carbon removal starts to look like, we need to move beyond consideration just of the capacity, technological or technical capacity to draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at a particular cost. That is technical and economic assessments. We also need to be thinking about the social, environmental, and other political and social dimensions of consideration of carbon removal. Right, so from all carbon removal is essential to we need sustainable carbon removal. That is carbon removal that's good across lots of different aspects. These sorts of understandings were brought out well in a recent paper. Again, this paper by David Morrow and colleagues, where they lay out 4 different principles for just carbon removal through time. And I'm going to leave you with these principles. This is the final slide. The first of these 4 principles, number 1, don't forget the long game. Carbon removal is just going to be one component of a long-term, full strategy of climate change response. But just because we don't have all of those elements sorted out now doesn't mean we should shy away from doing work in the near term. We need to get to work to understand what something like direct air capture can offer. And so set that enabling environment up now, and let's get to work. In considering what good carbon removal looks like, again, it's not just about the carbon. It's also about the social and environmental aspects. That's number 2. Split, don't lump. Don't think of carbon removal as one big thing. Look at direct air capture as a thing in relation to other forms of carbon removal, and then disaggregate what direct air capture actually is, because there are lots of different potential ways to do direct air capture with carbon storage. The best evaluation is probably going to take place at the granular project level. And finally, let's not bet the farm on all of this turning out well. As other folks have said, imagining that carbon removal is going to emerge and operate at a scale that is going to help us really tackle collectively climate change is a high-stakes bet. The best thing we can do right now is do all we can to prevent greenhouse gases from entering the atmosphere. But that may not be enough, and so doing work on direct air capture with carbon storage is essential starting now. Okay, that's all I have. If you want to find out more about the work of the Institute and our work on direct air capture and other forms of carbon removal, please come to our website, carbonremoval.info. Again, I'm grateful to friends at C2G for the invitation to speak with you. Thanks.